Alright, and welcome back. So in the previous video, we solved quadratic equations by factoring, but let's say we actually had to go backwards. Let's say we had to work backwards. Let's say we had the solutions. Let's say we had two solutions where x, say, was 4 and x was -5, and we want to find the quadratic equation that has these solutions. Find the quadratic equation that has the solutions. And to be completely honest with you, there's actually going to be an infinite number of quadratic equations that had these two solutions, but we're going to go ahead and find the simplest one, okay? Now remember when we're solving by factoring, so like let's say I had something like x squared minus 2x minus 8 is equal to 0. Remember, I'd have to go ahead and factor. And then once I factored, I would set each factor equal to 0. And then I would go ahead and solve from here. Well, what we're doing here is we're actually working backwards. We're given these two solutions, and we need to go every step backwards to find what the actual equation was, okay, in standard form. So as you can kind of notice, when we get our final answer, that is obtained by setting that factor equal to 0 when solving, and then we get x completely isolated. So we want to work backwards. So like let's say x is equal to 4 and x is equal to -5. We want to figure out what that binomial was. In this case, it was x minus 4 and x plus 2. We want to figure out what these binomials were. And the way to do that is to get this equation back equal to 0. So, for example, in this particular equation, if I want this equal to 0, I have to subtract 4 from each side to get x minus 4 is equal to 0. And that's my binomial right there. X minus 4 gets me the solution of 4, so that had to be one of our two factors. And if x was equal to -5, if I want to get this back equal to 0, I would have to add 5 to each side to get x plus 5 is equal to 0, and that's my other binomial, x plus 5. And now we're continuing to work backwards. So notice in this particular case, we are given the equation, we factored, which is undoing multiplication, and then got each factor set equal to 0 and solve. Well, in this case, we had the solutions. We went backwards. We kind of unsolved for x. Okay, we moved the 4 and the -5 over. And that got us our two factors. And now, remember, factoring is just undoing multiplication. So if we're working backwards, we got to go ahead and actually multiply this out. So we go ahead and we multiply this out, and we would get x squared plus 5x minus 4x minus 20 is equal to 0. Which then simplifies that x squared plus x minus 20 is equal to 0. And that would be the quadratic equation that had those two solutions, okay? So that's kind of how we work backwards. We're given the solutions, we unsolve for x by getting it equal to 0. So I subtracted 4, added 5. Once we get those factors, we multiply them out, combine like terms, that would end up being our solution, okay? Or that, I should say, would actually end up being our equation, not our solutions, okay? So let's take a look at another example. So let's say we wanted to find the equation that had the solutions of x equals -2 and x equals 1/2. Okay, now in this particular case, remember we want to go ahead and kind of unsolve for x. So over here I would add 2 to each side to get x plus 2 is equal to 0. And that would end up being one of our factors. One of our factors is going to be x plus 2. It's going to be x plus 2. Now over here, you could just go ahead and subtract by 1/2, but we generally don't like to have fractions in our binomials. We don't like to have fractions in our factors, so we want to get rid of this fraction. And the way to get rid of a fraction is to multiply each side by the least common denominator. In this case, the only denominator is 2, so I multiply each side by 2. because now what I'm going to end up getting is getting 2x is equal to 1. Notice my fraction is now gone. My fraction is now gone, and now I can just do one last step to unsolve for x. Subtract 1 from each side to get 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. And this would be my other factor, 2x minus 1. Okay, and if you went ahead and solved for x, you would add 1, divide by 2, you'd get right back to 1/2, so that's how you can always double check to make sure you have the right factor, okay? So we have factors of x plus 2, because that would get us a solution of -2, and 2x minus 1, because that would get us a solution of 1/2, and now we can go ahead and multiply this out to get our equation. So I distribute the x, I would get 2x squared minus x, now distribute the 2, plus 4x, minus 2, which would get me my final answer of 2x squared plus 3x minus 2 is equal to 0. Okay, and that's how we can kind of work backwards. Say we're given the solutions, that's how we can work backwards to get what the actual quadratic equation was, okay? And make sure that we're aware of this, because right now we're just doing this with quadratic equations, but we can do this with higher level polynomials, okay? We can do this with cubics, quartics, etc., etc. The only difference is you're going to have more factors, and you end up doing a little bit more multiplication, but the process would remain the exact same, so make sure that we are practicing these concepts, okay? All right, so make sure we're good with this. In future videos, we're going to cover solving quadratic inequalities. We're going to talk about complex numbers, something that might be totally new to some of you guys. And then we're going to also talk about how we can solve quadratics a few different ways, completing the square, quadratic formula, etc., etc., okay? So make sure you practice these, stay tuned, and pay attention to future videos. In the next one, we will be talking about solving quadratic inequalities.